Actually, the leap of faith, to give it the memorable name that Soren Kierkegaard bestowed upon it, is an imposture. As he himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. This effort is actually too much for the human mind and leads to delusions and manias. Religion understands perfectly well that the leap is subject to sharply diminishing returns, which is why it often doesn't in fact rely on faith at all, but instead corrupts faith and insults reason.
You are listening to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates science, secular humanism, and the courage it takes to embrace an evidence-based life of doubt and questioning. You are listening to episode number 10 of A Leap of Doubt. I'm your host, Nathan Dickey. We are talking in this episode about the 2018 record-breaking box office film Black Panther, which joins the ever-growing pantheon of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The film chronicles the rise of T'Challa, the titular Black Panther, as the new king of the fictional and technologically advanced African kingdom of Wakanda. It is a stunningly rendered and beautifully written story, an important and groundbreaking film with lots of potential for cultural and social consciousness raising. I'm joined by special guest Tony Reaves Jr. to discuss the art, politics, and social issues raised in this film and its impact so far and why we should support it. Welcome, Tony, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for inviting me on your show. It's a pleasure.
Yep, pleasure's mine. I wanted to have you on because you've had a lot to say about Black Panther on your social media posts that I thought were insightful, and your passion for this movie really comes out in your statements about why this is an important film that needs to be supported. So maybe let's start off introducing the mythological backstory and summary of the storyline. Give us a rundown.
Alrighty then. So with Black Panther, and I'm going to, for the 1 out of 1 millionth person that hasn't actually seen it, I'm going to avoid spoilers.
Oh, this is I should have said at the outset, this is, I was anticipating that this episode would be a spoiler-rich episode.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so there's that disclaimer at the beginning that spoilers are just fine for this episode.
Wonderful, wonderful. So then I'll jump right in. So all audience members have been forewarned. So Black Panther, at its core, is about a king, or rather a prince, Prince T'Challa, who is basically at the beginning of the story set to become the king of the fictional nation of Wakanda. And just as he is assuming his throne, what he doesn't realize is that there is, to use a Sherlock Holmes term, a game afoot, because the past of his fallen father is about to catch up with him. And a weapons dealer by the name of Ulysses Claw is once again scheming to sell weapons that belong to Wakanda that should never be in the hands of foreigners. And in the process of actually trying to obtain a Ulysses Claw and bring into justice, they find that a gentleman by the name of Eric Killmonger is set on his own scheme, who is working with Ulysses Claw. And to give you the backstory, and this is one of the major spoilers of the movie, Eric Killmonger turns out to be the cousin of T'Challa. And Eric Killmonger has put together a revenge scheme and a retribution scheme against Wakanda, because his father is the brother of King T'Chaka, who by this point is dead. And as we find out in the course of the story, King T'Chaka is responsible for the murder of his brother, N'Jobu. Mm-hmm. And because King T'Chaka kept his murder and the treason of, let's say, his brother a secret, because as it turns out, N'Jobu was actually collaborating with Ulysses Claw to steal vibranium. because this was kept a secret and because Killmonger was essentially abandoned in America with no parents and no one to look after him, Killmonger has come back to Wakanda to extract revenge. And Ulysses Clay is used as a tool for doing so. And so the story now becomes about a kingdom divided into two.
That was a really good rundown.
Thank you.
And embedded within that summary that you've just run through are a lot of politics and social issues that the film brings to the forefront to the audience. One of them being, is there a responsibility on the part of the Wakandan kingdom, which is a hidden kingdom kind of enclosed within a cloaking device and fronts itself as a third world kingdom or a third world nation in Africa.
Right.
Is there a responsibility on their part to share their technologically advanced resources with the rest of the world, with their fellow brothers and sisters throughout the world who are downtrodden and oppressed? This is one of the things that I appreciated about the movie, is that even the villains, with the exception of Ulysses Claw, who is just an all-around terrible and horrendous racist person.
Yeah.
With the exception of that villain, whose kind of career in that film is short-lived, the other villains, even Killmonger, you can understand their motivations and you can empathize with them to some extent.
I agree. And that's the thing about Black Panther, is that it recognizes that even when people do terrible things, they're doing those things out of a belief that they are in the right and that they're doing it for the greater good. It's really just a matter of whose greater good holds more value. And that's not an easy question to answer. And I'm going to go ahead and answer your question about whether Wakanda actually, let's say, has a responsibility. My answer to that would be, yes, they have a responsibility to share the technology, but up to a certain point, right? And in my opinion, the whole story is structured around who is in a position of needing the technology the most. And clearly, when you look from Killmonger's point of view, the thing that's interesting about that is that his situation, living amongst poverty, it's clear that he understands and he knows the value that Wakanda's technology could actually give to those that he's been raised among. And when you have communities that are poor, and particularly communities of color, when you look at that kind of situation, the Wakandan technology would benefit them the absolute most, in the sense that they have the ability to literally reshape their world for the better. And when communities are not using them for nefarious purposes, those are the kinds of communities that could actually use Wakandan technology. But Wakanda is also aware that there are people that will use it for ill.
Right.
So you can understand from a certain point of view why they would be hesitant about doing that. Because another unfortunate reality is that even today, taking it outside of the story of Black Panther, there are people that are willing to actually say that they are willing to use technology that exists right now for the greater good, but will turn around and use it for evil. So it's about deciding, how do you figure out what somebody's motivation is when it comes to the use of technology in our lives.
Right. Yeah, and this is something I like to think about when I watch science fiction or futuristic depictions like this. Thinking about the implications for if this was a true story, if this was really happening. I can absolutely understand why the Wakandans want to keep themselves hidden and put up this front as a third world country, because the reality, again, as you said, going outside of Black Panther, if this was a reality, this story, very few people would deny that white capitalist power structures would immediately want to start meddling and getting involved where they don't belong with
Right,
with resources like vibranium.
right. And the thing about that too is that what gets overlooked is that Wakandans, being as advanced that they know so much more in theory about geopolitics than they're actually willing to let on, because they have the ability to have monitored, let's say, nations, and they keep up with the news, they keep up with the stories, and the war dogs that work as undercover operatives for the nation of Wakanda, they themselves are keeping Wakanda aware of what is going on. So it's pretty convincing to me that they are very much aware of what capitalist nations have done with the technology that they have.
Hmm.
And therefore, they use these undercover operations to, amongst other things, fill each other in about basically the state of the world as it is. And their knowledge, it's never spoken about in the film, but it would make sense to me that they will report back and say, there's no way we can let this nation, or there's no way we can let this leader get their hands on this technology. Because what they say they're going to do with it is a totally different reality from what they are doing with the technology that they already have.
Mm-hmm.
And they're wise enough to be able to do so.
Yeah, and kind of going back to the issues the film raises about responsibility, I really appreciated the depiction of Njobu as the brother of King T'Chaka.
Yeah.
I kind of wish that the film maybe would have fleshed out his story a little bit more, but of course, at a little over 2 hours, the film kind of ran its course content wise, but and it's jam packed with just so many amazing things already. But
Yeah.
you've kind of in one post that I remember, you kind of fleshed out the character and kind of speculated or did some commentary on the character of Njobu, kind of going into more detail than the film let on. And I really liked your commentary / analysis of Njobu as a character who came to be more than just a spy, more than just somebody who embedded himself in African American culture for the purpose of reporting back to Wakanda. He actually arrived at a level of sympathy for the people in the community he was around.
Yeah.
And so, as you put it, he couldn't bear to see people that looked like him all around, brothers and sisters who descended from Africa, suffer so badly under Western capitalist structures that kept them perpetually down on a micro and macro level. And I'm quoting you there, and I think that was a really good, insightful commentary.
Well, thank you very much. And what I'm going to do is I want to basically kind of add to that, in the sense that the reason why I felt that Njobu was so sympathetic in the time that he was on screen is because I could relate to the humanist in him,
Mm-hmm.
even though he had essentially betrayed his nation. And I do feel still, after watching that Njobu's heart was in the right place, because when you're in a position of being able to do something about the strife that you see, and yet you are unable to do so, that is something that can truly tear at your conscience. And I think that Njobu, the thing that moved me so much about him as a character, and also Sterling K. Brown's performance, which I thought is wonderful.
He really,
Yeah,
he really did what he could with the time he had on screen.
absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I want to point out is, like, one of the reasons why I feel like the time that we spent with this character, as limited as it was just right, was because, in part, Njobu felt like a truly, I would say, he felt like a true radical, in the sense that we understand political radicals today.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that Njobu once again, he knows that his nation has the ability to just do one thing that could turn the situation around, not necessarily just even for the world, but just on a day-to-day basis, for his neighborhood that he was sent to spy on, for the family that he is now raising in secret. He knows that he has the tools and the abilities to be able to do something about the fact that he knows that his neighborhoods and his own family's resources are limited, given his position, and yet he is unable to do so. And the idea that a character like him can respond so vividly and so humanely to the suffering that he sees, that's very powerful. And what Sterling K. Brown does is that he suggests that arc of going from impassive to active through his body language, through his eyes, and through his movements, and the way that he talks and the way that he carries himself. And he suggests so much with his character in every gesture and every moment and every spoken word that at least in my opinion, I felt like I understood the arc without having to have seen it.
Right. And that kind of speaks to both the power of his acting skill and also just how well written the character and the storyline is.
I agree. And the other thing about that is that that's very much the kind of arc that freedom fighters have actually gone through in history. And so when the movie actually shows you in Jobu's apartment and you go and you look at the paperwork on the wall and, you see Public Enemy records and you see posters referencing the civil rights movement, that's not a mistake, because so many people who were passive observers of their time in the civil rights era and even before that were moved in exactly the same manner that Njobu was. People like Rosa Parks, people like Martin Luther King, they were moved to go from impassive to active for the liberation of the societies in which they lived and struggled under.
Popular culture played a big part in that, would you say?
Absolutely.
And
I would say.
Yeah, it was almost a meta commentary that Black Panther is one of these pieces of popular culture that has the potential to, as I said in the introduction, raise the social and cultural consciousness about the place of African Americans in this country and people of color elsewhere throughout the world. Would you say that Black Panther represents a cultural watershed moment for Black identity in America? Is it a defining moment?
I would say in certain ways. Now, and by no means as somebody who is a person of color and who is a working class person of color, in no way would I pretend that this is going to, let's say, advance civil rights per se. But I absolutely believe that what Black Panther does is that it opens up a discussion that genuinely needs to be had. And the power of films like this is that they have the ability to get their audience members really engaged in thinking about social issues and about the socioeconomic and political realities that Black people faced. But not just that either. I also think that the movie has the ability to engage people in a discussion about culture clashes. Because another area that I thought Black Panther handled very, very intelligently is the clash between being raised as a traditional African and somebody who is of African descent but raised in America, and that tension that is felt between the two cultures and the misunderstandings that take place between the two cultures. And it's a wonderful thing, and it's very observant. And I would say that it's a watershed moment in the sense that very rarely is a Hollywood studio going to allow a story like that functions at its basic roots as a comic book adventure to be that political. It's definitely a watershed moment in that it's absolutely one of the most political pieces of popular entertainment that's been out in the last 30 years. And the value of Black Panther is that it allows people to really discuss the issues and to discuss the culture clashes and to discuss the politics that are engaged by the film in a way that would have been impossible if it was, let's say, a traditional, let's say, documentary or docudrama about those very same political realities.
Yeah, this is and the Afrofuturism that is front and center and unapologetic throughout the movie is also something that's extremely rare in American cinema and
non-existent, actually.
Non-existent. Yeah. Okay, and what you said about if this was, say, a docudrama or a documentary, it wouldn't have the same appeal. I go back to really the only instance of what you could maybe charitably call Afrofuturism is a docudrama, and that was, I believe it's called Raised in Flames or Born in Flames.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with that film.
I'm personally not, but I'll be happy to check it out.
Mm-hmm. That kind of brought up the same issues of kind of the political and social struggles that people of color go through, and the concept of revolution and those kinds of things. But yeah, this is unique in that way that it's a story about Afrofuturism that, as you said, is virtually non-existent. And so I guess it's kind of a waiting game. We'll wait to see if this will kind of inspire Hollywood studios to explore that theme further in future films.
And I look forward to that. But even more importantly, I think that one thing that I hope and that I feel more confident about myself is that Hollywood is actually paying attention to Black audiences that respond to stories that allow them to be just as complex and as heroic on screen as so many white storytellers are able to actually get away with, and white actors are able to get away with. The real watershed here is the idea that a film can actually be made where African Americans are not just portrayed as the help or abused or beaten, and we are not just there to be abused and poverty porn. We can actually be at the center of the types of stories that are commonplace for white actors to be able to portray and for white filmmakers to be able to put on screen.
I can't think of a single example of a movie like this where a supporting character like the CIA agent Everett K. Ross, as one of the few white characters in the film, takes a back seat, is relying almost 100% on the help he receives from the predominantly Black cast and characters.
Absolutely. And that's not a mistake either, because the film is very much aware of that. The filmmakers are very much aware of that very idea, that they're going to turn the idea of the help on its head. And the filmmakers are very much aware of that, because in the course of, let's say, the last 25, 30, 35 years of cinema, it was the exact opposite, as you're probably already aware. There was always just the Black sidekick who was there to rely on the white help to save the day. And it's very much a play on that very trope in fiction.
Yeah, I think one of the main functions of this movie is to raise the discomfort felt by white audience members, raise their discomfort, which needs to be done, I think, at seeing white people take a back seat and not be the center of attention.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why it wasn't a mistake that the character of Agent Ross was literally shouted out and down by one of the supporting characters.
I loved that scene with Shuri, played by Letitia Wright, when he wakes up in the hospital or in her lab, and she says something along the lines of, "Oh, good morning, colonizer."
Actually, I believe that the line on that was that, "Don't scare me like that, colonizer."
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, and I talk about discomfort among white audience members. It's kind of it's kind of a sad commentary that discomfort actually has to be felt by white people because of things like white fragility, which you've also commented on. What are some of the most ridiculous instances of white fragility in response to this movie that you've encountered?
Well, actually, I got a few examples, but right off the bat, I can actually think of actual friends of mine that I know, literally in real life. There are friends of mine that I know that actually refuse to go into a theater and watch this movie because they're actually afraid that they won't belong with a bunch of Black audience members,
Oh wow.
watching an Afrocentric story. And I told them that's absolutely ridiculous. The movie was made to be seen by all types of audience members.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're not going to come out and attack you for wanting to actually support us to watch something that we want everybody to see. We want Black people, white people, Asian people, people all over the world to go see this movie. It's important for you to see it, and it's important for you to be there to support us.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one example. Another example is I've seen a very recent article about, and I'm not sure if this actually came from the Hollywood Reporter. I'm not sure who it actually belongs to, but there's an actual article out there being edited right now that says, well, box office numbers no longer mean what they used to in the wake of Black Panther's success.
Mm-hmm. I
And
saw
that's an
that.
absolutely ridiculous assertion to make. Why wouldn't they mean what they should mean? Box office means that people actually wanted to go see this, and they did, and they supported, and they voted with their dollar.
Mm-hmm. I believe
So,
that was from an app preview for a headline from the Washington Post.
interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's like, this very idea that, somebody can go about and sort of, we'll say, move the goalposts on what is considered a success or what box office success would actually mean about what audiences want to go see is really, I think, very, very offensive. Because we wouldn't say the same thing about a Tom Cruise movie making $500 million over the course of a month. We
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say that about a James Cameron movie or a Peter Jackson movie or about 9 out of 10 blockbusters that actually go out and become successful. It
Mm-hmm.
only gets to be questioned because of who stars in it and who actually made the movie and the audiences that are actually going to go see that. When I hear statements like that, what I'm really hearing is we didn't expect for you to be paying attention as Black audience members.
Mm. Yeah, that is pretty ridiculous. And another aspect of this that I think is really important to bring to the forefront is the power and importance of inspirational stories and myth making. So, a lot of commentators have said things to the effect of people who are not necessarily against what this movie is about, but who criticize it by saying, well, this is just myth making. It's kind of it's fantasy and it presents an unrealistic picture of futuristic politics or whatever it is they say, and
Right. Yeah.
kind of in the process diminish or ignore just how powerful storytelling in our culture is and the potential all stories with any kind of mythic epic appeal have for impacting attitudes in real life culture.
Right.
Star Trek saw this effect with characters like Uhura, who
Yeah.
was cited by Mae Jemison as her main inspiration to join the space program.
hmm
I'm sure you will answer in the affirmative, but does this film have the potential to increase interest in things like science, technology, STEM fields in general among young Black Americans?
Absolutely. And not only do I believe that, it's already happened, and there are already programs that are actually being put in place in response to the success of Black Panther by the actual studio themselves, Disney / Marvel. right? They're actually using this as an ability to actually create programs that allow children, particularly children of color, to be able to engage, STEM fields and computer science and technology research because they know precisely the power that comes from actually showing people that look like them being able to do remarkable things with the great tools that we have that we're not always exposed to, but that are available.
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely, without question, not only do I believe that, I know it, and it's already happening, which means that the group and the people in the studios that are responsible for a movie know how responsible they are for actually generating that very interest. And they know what I know, which is that popular culture absolutely has the ability to truly stimulate the mind and the curiosity of young people. And it does have the ability to truly make a difference in the lives of those that are actually affected by the vision that is on screen. And not just in Star Trek, but all sorts of narrative fiction. And when people actually say what it is that you said, which is, oh, well, it's unrealistic and, that's not the point. The point is to actually inspire the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, in America, all sorts of people were inspired by the imaginations of narrative fiction creators.
Absolutely.
The entire idea of comic book culture is a result of people being inspired by narrative fiction. And once again, this is yet another thing that's never questioned for white audience members and for non-people of color to actually embrace. Millions of people were inspired to be better by Superman and by Batman, right?
Right.
But why wouldn't that be the same for narrative fiction like Black Panther that centers African American characters in a unique way?
There's no reasonable argument to say that it can't have that effect. And anybody who tries to deny that it could have that potential either has a vested interest in telling different kinds of stories that have already been told countless times already and that have gotten old. The victim and abuse and poverty porn that you've mentioned earlier. And I think those kinds of stories and those kinds of narratives absolutely have a negative and degrading effect on especially people of color, but it also damages the understanding among white communities. It instills stereotypes and caricatures that are absolutely not healthy.
Right. And more so to add a bit of nuance to that, it's not like, his stories that actually point out the abuse of and the absolute dehumanization of Black people are not important. They are important. They're important as a reminder so that we understand where we come from and how we can try to avoid the kinds of attitudes that were pervasive in the past. So it's not like they don't have their place.
Movies like 12 Years a Slave
right.
do have a place in understanding history and how to avoid that.
Right. But nevertheless, it's not all that we should be seeing. And it's certainly not all that African-American filmmakers and African-American actors have to offer in terms of the types of stories that they want to be able to tell.
For sure.
And the problem that I have with that is that that's most of what we have seen in mainstream American film.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So there's a place for it, but it's not all that we have to offer. And it's certainly not something that we should be reinforcing is all that storytellers have to offer in terms of stories about African Americans and Black people worldwide. We're bigger than that.
Yeah. As you said in one of your Facebook videos, the Black community, they're more than the athletes and the rappers. They're also the scientists and the mathematicians and the scholars and the historians. And popular culture in America doesn't often give the geniuses in Black culture the time of day that they deserve. they're out there, just like back in the 30s and 40s and before, when women were barred from entering institutions of higher learning to become things like mathematicians and engineers.
Hmm.
Uh, it's not. It was, in fact, it wasn't until recent decades that stories of women who worked in places like NASA in its early days have been told. Um,
Yeah, and particularly Black women, particularly women of color.
mhm.
And because another interesting thing about that is that there were degrees of privilege even amongst women themselves.
Right.
So even while, let's say, white women were just barely being able to actually get the rights to be able to go to universities and to be able to go and create careers for themselves, even then, the Black women who were every bit as talented were denied those very same opportunities. And it's interesting to me that even amongst the oppressed, there were still levels of oppression amongst the oppressed themselves.
Mhm. Yeah, they kind of absorbed the racism and the discrimination that they experienced, and it's a psychological effect that people who are at the receiving end of that kind of treatment, in some cases, treat others who are below them in this completely fabricated hierarchy that society has set up, treat them the same way because they've absorbed that from people who are higher up in this supposed hierarchy.
Right.
I think movies like this, movies like Black Panther, turn so many assumptions of what audience members want to be exposed to on its head, because it's not just the predominantly black cast. There's also an amazing portrayal of women in this movie as brilliant scientists and fighters, women who are not at the receiving end of abuse and who aren't objectified and treated as objects of pleasure, both
Right.
for the audience and for the characters. They're powerful, they're strong, they're brilliant. That's something that really struck out at me as well. Is the depiction of women in this movie is superb.
I would agree. And another thing that's I think worth pointing out about the female characters in the film is that they are not just active participants in the narrative, but they have heroic arcs separate and above from the characters in the movie, right? So they act independently. And the other thing about that too that I think people have to be careful with is that they're not just admirable because they're powerful and strong, but they're also admirable because of their ability to be vulnerable. And that's a balance that also has to be very carefully maintained both in the narrative and in depiction of African American and Black women in popular culture. Because another thing that I think gets lost in the conversation about strong Black female characters is this idea that Black women are only allowed to be strong and powerful, and that's all that they have to offer. But no, that's not all they have to offer.
Mm-hmm.
They have the ability to be vulnerable. They have the ability to be truly emotionally intelligent, to be nurturing, and to be able to balance those ideas. And so another strength of Black Panther is that the characters that are depicted as strong and powerful are also extremely nurturing and are allowed their moments to be vulnerable to each other and to show a sense of community that makes it so that women are free to not always just have their guard up, but to also be able to confess things to each other and to be able to cry with each other and to be able to be vulnerable and to have arguments and to have disagreements, right? And that's another element of complexity that is worth celebrating, in that the characters don't just have one emotion. They're not always in one mode. They're allowed to have love lives that don't define them per se as human beings, but nevertheless enhance their emotional arcs,
Mm-hmm.
if
Yeah,
that made any sense.
oh yeah, absolutely. They're multifaceted. They're complex, and again, just another example of the story writing, script writing ability and character writing ability of the people who made this film.
Right.
And in fact, I would say that the level of complexity, both of the storyline and the characters, make this probably the best Marvel film yet.
I would say that it's right in there with Captain America: The Winter Soldier.
Mm-hmm. And Captain America: The Winter Soldier was also a movie that was highly political, and which kind of revealingly didn't receive the kind of backlash that Black Panther did for
Right.
somewhat obvious and very sad reasons.
Well, yeah, and once again, it's an idea that what Black Panther does, and particularly, in the story of Killmonger, is that it opens up a wound that is felt by Black Americans and Black people worldwide that feel like they've been left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about that is that, and it kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, in the sense that we want people of all cultures to be able to see this because we want them to be able to have a discussion about the things that they're uncomfortable about, particularly white Americans in the United States in the age of Trump who have the capacity to genuinely ignore or disregard the suffering of African Americans. One of the things that can make white audience members uncomfortable is actually having to discuss and to face this idea that people that they probably know and the people that they probably interact with but tend to disregard, they are killmongers. There are killmongers among us who are abandoned. There are killmongers among us who have been left behind. And the fact that the movie engages in a discussion about privilege and about what ignoring your privilege can actually do to the psyche of those who are discriminated against, that opens the wound because now white audience members are going to have to discuss something that makes them very uncomfortable, which is having to discuss the level of privilege that they hold in their societies.
And that's a huge reason why, upon seeing this movie, I really wanted to talk about it because my podcast is called A Leap of Doubt, and a big emphasis and focus of the podcast is the idea of questioning, whether it's questioning religion or the status quo, certain assumptions held by society. And one of the things I'm trying to question is my own white privilege, which I'm often unaware of. And
Yeah.
I'm somebody who needs my consciousness raised almost all the time. Like I can intellectually understand that I have privilege, but in application, I often fail in really getting down to the level of understanding in a gritty, down to earth way just how privileged I am.
Well, yeah. And the idea is that it's always going to be a struggle. And it's always going to be something, it's never something where you reach a boss level at and you say, okay, well, I've defeated it now. It's always a journey.
Yep.
It's
sure.
always a journey. And it's a journey for all of us. And that very sense of humility is what's going to be able to help you be able to engage with and sympathize with people of color and understand where they're coming from. And it's very, very admirable of your podcast to really touch on those types of issues. And it is something that does genuinely need to be addressed, and particularly within the secular community that tends to believe that a lack of religion solves all issues, because it doesn't.
I like what I cannot remember who said it, but this is the original with me. Somebody I know a while back said something to the effect of, atheism might be the first step, but humanism is the next 1,000 steps after that.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I have to agree with that. And it's also very, very important to point out that knowing that you have a level of privilege in society does not automatically make you a lost cause. But what it does mean is that you just have to be humble and you have to be willing to listen and engage people who have the types of experiences that you don't. And the fact that you're willing to do that is admirable. And if only many, many, many more people in the community could do that, we would be in a better place.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a flip side to the backlash among white culture to Black Panther, and this is something you've also touched on, and that's the backlash against the movie from the Black community. Why do you think this particular backlash exists? Do you think the Black community has been oppressed and unfairly caricatured and stereotyped for so long in popular culture that maybe they've become distrustful of cinema that portrays them as extremely intelligent and heroic and masters of their own fate? Is there an element of distrust and suspicion that kind of plays into why there's a Black backlash against it?
I would say that there is that element. I'm not going to speak for myself because I'm not a political activist. I'm not somebody who's a surveyor of all Black culture, and I'm going to acknowledge the limits of my own understanding. So don't take me as an authority.
Right.
But what I think it is truly is there is an element of distrust, and there's also an element of fear, in the sense that there's an element that the very acknowledgement and the very ability of a studio like Disney to have created a story like this, with its Marvel counterparts and with, the Black filmmakers that are responsible for putting this together, there is an element of fear that genuinely a kind of message is going to be sneaked in that is going to actually undermine the very ideas of revolution that are actually engaged by the movie. And there is a distrust, and that distrust is valid in the sense that Hollywood has genuinely done an abominable job of really being able to engage with African American audiences about the issues that they deal with. And so, yes, there is a distrust within the community, but with stories like this actually coming out, we have the power to be able to say, now let's turn this around. Let's be creative now in a way that we haven't been allowed for a very long time. But the distrust is there. And one of the things that I talked about is there is a discussion that happens amongst Black audience members and amongst the community at large, where we actually talk about, well, we will support Black Panther, but we won't support films like 12 Years a Slave. We won't support films like Birth of a Nation. We won't support other films. But, that's just not true.
Mm-hmm.
We've supported all types of films, and we've supported filmmakers that make those types of films. Spike Lee, John Singleton, Ava DuVernay. These are filmmakers that we've come out and shown up in force for, right? And what we want is, once again, one of the things that I push back on is this idea that one type of story is less valid than another.
Right.
And I want to just come back to this idea that Black Panther and stories like that I hope are going to be made in the future, they are valuable for stimulating the imaginations of the audience members, and particularly the young audience members, in a way that does create a seed that will instigate them to be able to push themselves and to create change in their own communities, and to be able to engage with things like comic book culture and technology. And that has a powerful effect. And that's no less valid than being able to learn about actual African American history, the history of slavery, the history of civil rights, and being able to engage with socio-political films and socially conscious films like Boys in the Hood, or A Poetic Justice, or A Menace to Society. There's room for all of those types of stories. One is not less or more valid than the other. They all have an important piece. And when you just have one type and you ignore the other, there's a tendency to ignore the ability for imagination and fictional narratives to be able to engage in the real stories that we deal with in the everyday world. And the only reason that kind of distrust exists amongst the Black community towards Hollywood. And the only reason why the discussion is actually had to start with about why we should support this is because of the fact that Hollywood has earned every bit of that distrust in the way that it's treated, not just the types of stories that are actually made, but in the way that it's actually treated Black directors and Black actors in the past.
Right.
So the distrust is actually earned, and it's not up to the Black community to be able to defend itself and come up and say, well, this is why we're not coming to see the movie. We should never have to explain ourselves in that manner. It should be up to Hollywood to come to us and bring us the entertainment that it shouldn't, that it had every bit of the ability to generate, but that they weren't interested in, because once again, their privilege allows them to ignore the fact that we wanted a Black Panther 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You know what I mean? So yes, there's distrust, but it's distrust that
is valid.
Right. It's right. Exactly. It's valid. That is valid, and that needs to be acknowledged. And I would very much say that it's the bed that Hollywood created that it has to sleep in, and it has to earn our trust. And another thing about that, so I'm glad you brought that up, because this is not the dispiriting treatment of Black creative talent in Hollywood is not something that's in the far past. It's happening now.
Right.
Now. And so when you have an actor like Matt Damon go on a project, and I wanted to talk about, I was desperate to talk about this.
Great.
There's an episode of Project Greenlight that came out a couple of years ago, and Matt Damon actually made a statement to a Black producer by the name of F.B. Brown, who is actually a producer of Dear White People and a lot of, the Farrelly Brothers' other works. F.B. Brown is African American, and she worked with, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck to basically create the movie and get the process started. And there was an argument that took place between F.B. Brown and Matt Damon about, the script and some of the humor in it. And it became a discussion about who holds the power and the ability to make creative decisions and where her place belongs, quote unquote. And basically he said something to the effect of, and I want to make sure that I try to recall this as best as I can, but Matt Damon said something to the effect of, the Black actors, the people, the characters in the movie, and the Black creative talent, they should be the leaders of the movie, but not the leaders of the show, or something like that.
Oh, wow.
And right. Effie Brown had a look on her face, and her reaction was just, she couldn't believe it. Like, how could Matt Damon, a person who himself claims to be liberal and, pro-Democrat, say something like that? Did he really say that? Did he really say that? Like, but here's the thing. These attitudes are believed by people who are supposed to be on the side of democracy and anti-racism. But it just shows you, and it shows me, that the need for Black storytellers in Hollywood is all that more urgent because of things like this. And this is why I said that the distrust by the Black community of Hollywood studios is valid. And it's because these attitudes that our power can only go so far. We'll let you be the lead in the movie. We'll let you be, let's say, we'll let you have your superhero story. But we don't believe that Black creative talent has the ability to pull those kinds of stories off. They don't have the ability to lead a studio, to lead a Warner Brothers or a Fox or a Disney. No. Their power doesn't belong behind the desk. They can't be financing these. Those kinds of power structures have yet to be challenged. Truly.
It's because so many people who are ostensibly liberal or view themselves as liberal and democratic and progressive, they're a lot of times their idea of not being racist is, oh, I'm not racist because I have Black friends or Asian friends or whatever. That's like the extent of their belief as to why they're not racist.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I wanted to say about that is that the another thing about Black Panther is that it allows filmmakers like Ryan Coogler, who is brilliant, to be able to walk up to the Matt Damons of Hollywood and go, "Fuck you, we belong here, and I have the ability to tell this story, and you're not going to get in the way." And it's interesting because that's exactly what Ryan Coogler did. And Ryan Coogler, to give you some backstory, he's responsible for making two extraordinary movies, in my opinion. He made Fruitvale Station back in 2012. He wrote and directed that. And he wrote and directed Creed, which is a spinoff of the Rocky franchise, which I thought was wonderful. And he actually came into the studio when the studio kind of approached him about making Black Panther. And he said, I want to bring my own creative crew because I want the look of this movie to be distinct. I want to bring in Black crew members like Ruth E. Carter, who was the costume designer, African American. I want to bring in Rachel Morrison, who is the only woman to be nominated for director of photography at the Academy Awards. I want to bring in Black production designers. I want to bring in Black art directors and a Black crew and my own Black executive producer to protect me and a Black co-writer who is Joe Robert Cole, who co-wrote the script with Ryan Coogler. I want to be able to bring those guys in because we have something to say. We want to make this a moment for audience members all over the world. And so that way we can walk up to a Matt Damon or a Ben Affleck and say, go fuck yourself. We can tell these stories. We belong here. We belong behind the desk. We belong in a place where we are running the show.
And that's another hope that we as progressives and allies can have for the future going forward. Another watershed hope for this movie is that it will plant a seed, as you said earlier, and kind of make the uphill struggle of Black filmmakers that you've talked about before less of an uphill journey and a little bit easier, less of a struggle.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Because we belong in a position where we're able to tell stories that are commonplace for white studio heads to be able to greenlight, and for white actors and not people of color to be able to portray and engage in. We wanted to get to a point where it's just not even a question. Of course, we can have Black superhero movies. Of course, we can have Black Afrofuturism on film. Of course, we can have, you know, Black action movies and Black comedies and Black dramas and Black romances and all types of things. It won't even be a question. It will be as common as being able to pick up and drink water.
Right.
That's what our hope is, because only when it becomes as common as everything else that there doesn't have to be a discussion about why it's even happening will we feel like we're finally in a position as a community of African Americans of being equal with our white peers.
And I guess there's kind of it's kind of a double-edged sword that this movie has generated so much important discussion, but this is the kind of discussion that should have been had centuries ago, a long, long time before now. The conversation and the cultural discussion this film has generated is at least a century, if not more, too late, I think. And it's kind of an indication of where we are as a society.
I have to agree. And another thing about this movie too that I think is really cool is that it also allows Black audience members to have a discussion with each other about how we deal with socioeconomic oppression. And one of the subjects about the film is this idea of liberalism versus radicalism. So T'Challa represents the liberal in the sense that he believes in kindness, he believes in fairness, he believes in decency, but he also believes in maintaining an order. Mm-hmm. And up until the very end of the movie, he desires to maintain that order to a degree. Whereas Killmonger, as we'll say, the nephew of the king, who has been forgotten about and virtually thrown away and who has come for revenge, he represents radicalism. in the sense that he is there to upset order. He is there to upset the bourgeois in a way for the sake of liberation. And one of the discussions that the movie actually brings up is one approach more valid than the other? And what's going to actually bring us justice versus just making us all complacent in our society? That's not an easy question to answer. And that's something that civil rights activists have also dealt with. And what civil rights activists still deal with. How much radicalism is enough before, liberalism has to be reintroduced, before a sense of order can be brought in? And what are the limits of radicalism? And how much collateral damage is acceptable before we say that radicalism is the right thing to be doing at all times? And ideally, what we all want to say as a collective is that we need both to be working together.
Yeah, and this is something that the film handles really well because it doesn't provide just simple answers that are straightforward and moralistic. It doesn't have like this preachy moralistic message of, let's just be kind to everyone and adhere to this superhero standard of,
Right.
I guess you could say it's kind of a buzzword nowadays, but the classical liberalism that today we might impute to characters like Superman in the 50s, or kind of this middle of the road approach of let's not kind of entertain any uncomfortable notions at all and just kind of go by the book and by the rules every time. And the film doesn't do that preachy moralistic thing that I think a lot of superhero comic writers in the past did, and it introduces a level of complexity and nuance.
Yeah, and it's up to audience members to really discover for themselves what it is how would they approach this situation? How would they handle this? And, great storytelling allows people to really confront ideas in exactly that same fashion, where you're not just going to be able to walk out and say, well, this person was completely right and this person was completely wrong. It's an idea that film and storytelling is allowed to pose questions rather than give you answers all the time. And it's up to you to decide at the end of the day whether somebody was right or wrong. But it's most important that you understand characters and that you understand motivation.
Well, we've been getting into a lot of really deep stuff, and I guess to kind of wrapping up towards the end of this interview, and to give it kind of a lighter mood for to kind of decompress the conversation, I guess. What would you say is the best moment, the moment in the film that stuck with you the most, and that you would say is your favorite scene?
Oh man, wow. So many. But I have to say that the throne room confrontation that takes place when Killmonger first arrives to the throne room for the very first time, and he demands that King T'Challa tell the royal court who he is, and just goads him until he finally uses the Xhosa language that none of them thought that he remembered, and reveals himself as Prince N'Jaka.
Mm-hmm.
When he finally comes out and reveals who he is truly and challenges the throne of King T'Challa, that was amazing. That really was. That was just the ultimate "fuck you, I'm here" moment. And I thought that Michael B. Jordan's performance in that sequence was incredible.
Yeah, I agree. I had chills down my spine at that scene myself. And I guess for myself to go for a less poignant and meaningful scene, I have to admit that I really loved the fight scene in the Korean club. And I consider the choreography and the execution of that scene to be right up there with the fight scene in the church in the movie Kingsman.
The Secret Service, yeah.
Yeah, it's right. I consider that scene in Kingsman to be probably the best fight scene, maybe in film history. I might be kind of going over the top by saying that. But the fight scene in the Korean club in Black Panther is right up there with that. And of course, the scene you described is also extremely poignant and emotionally charged and well played and well acted. Thank you so much for discussing these things. And if there's anything you want to leave any potential listeners I may have with, if there's anything like you want to wrap up with, and like any final thoughts or final words of wisdom, you can feel free to share that right now before we sign off.
Well, I don't have a whole lot. I simply just want to say that I'm really happy that Black Panther has been as successful as it is, and I would just encourage, your audience members to do everything that you can to support Black filmmakers, Black artists, because we need more Black Panthers, and we need stories like this to become mainstream. And thank you. Just thank you for this conversation. Thank you for allowing me on your podcast. It's a pleasure, and this has just been great, and I've really enjoyed this.
Oh yeah, likewise. I've really enjoyed it too, and the pleasure's all mine. Has been a great interview.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to A Leap of Doubt. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. If you want to get involved in the kinds of discussions this show is meant to encourage, you can find a discussion group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/ALOP discussion. You can follow me and get in touch with me on Twitter, where my username is @thenatheist. Feedback and criticisms are always welcome. The opening clip is an excerpt from the audiobook God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, courtesy of Hachette Audio. Text copyright 2007 by Christopher Hitchens. Audio production copyright 2007 Hachette Audio. Used with permission. The music is Jade by Esther Nicholson and is used under license. I'd like to take this moment to give a very special shout out to my 3 patrons, Jeff Prebeg, Jeannie Eichard, and Torsten Pill. If you enjoy the work I do, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/a leap of doubt.